Good morning. Page 321. There was one attack in the daytime. Tommy gunners were moved up to one of the gaps opposite the balcony of the Step-Leg Administration Building, which was packed with important personages sheltering under broad army epaulets, or the narrow ones of the Public Prosecutor's Department, and holding cameras or even movie cameras. The soldiers were in no hurry. They merely advanced just far enough into the breach for the alarm to be given, whereupon the rebel platoons responsible for the defense of the breach rushed out to man the barricade, brandishing their pikes and holding stones and mud bricks, and then, from the balcony, movie cameras whirred and pocket cameras clicked, taking care to keep the Tommy gunners out of the picture. Disciplinary officers, prosecutors, party officials, and all the rest of them, party members to a man, of course, laughed at the bizarre spectacle of the impassioned savages with pikes, well-fed and shameless. These grand personages mocked their starved and cheated fellow citizens from the balcony, and found it all very funny. Then warders, too, stole up to the gaps and tried to slip nooses with hooks over the prisoners, as though they were hunting wild animals or the abominable snowmen, hoping to drag out a talker. But what they mainly counted on were deserters, rebels with cold feet. The radio blared away. Come to your senses. Leave the camp through the gaps in the wall. At those points, we shall not fire. Those who come over will not be tried for mutiny. The Commission's response over the camp radio was this: anybody who wants to run away can go right ahead, through the main gate if he likes. We are holding no one back. One who did so was a member of the Commission itself, former Major Makayev, who walked up to the main guardhouse as though he had business there, as though not because they would have detained him, nor because they had a means of shooting him in the back, but because it is almost impossible to play the traitor with your comrades looking on and howling their contempt. For 3 weeks he had kept up a pretense. Now at last he could give free rein to his defeatism and his anger with the rebels for wanting freedom which he, Makayev, did not want, nor working off his debts to the bosses. He broadcast an appeal to surrender and reviled those who favored holding out longer. Here are some sentences from his own written account of this broadcast. Somebody has decided that freedom can be won with the help of sabers and pikes. They want to expose the bullets people who won't take their bits of iron. They want to expose 2 bullets, people who won't take their bits of iron. We have been promised a review of our cases. The generals are patiently negotiating with us, but Slushenkov regards this as a sign of weakness on their part. The Commission is a screen for gangster debauchery. Conduct the negotiations in a manner worthy of political prisoners, and do not prepare for senseless resistance. The holes in the wall gaped for weeks. The wall had not remained whole so long while the revolt was on. And in those weeks only about a dozen men fled from the camp. Why, surely the rest did not believe in victory. Why? Were they not appalled by the thought of the punishment ahead? They were. Did they not want to save themselves for their family's sake? They did. They were torn, and thousands of them perhaps had secretly considered this possibility. The invitation to the former juveniles had a firm legal base, but the social temperature of this plot of land had risen so high that if souls were not transmuted, they were purged of dross, and the sordid law saying that we only live once, that being determines consciousness, and that every man's a coward when his neck is at stake, ceased to apply for that short time in a circumscribed place. The laws of survival and of reason told people that they must all surrender together or flee individually. But they did not surrender, and they did not flee. They rose to that spiritual plane from which executioners are told, "The devil take care for his own, torture us, savage us." And the operation, so beautifully planned, to make the prisoners scatter like rats through the gaps in the wall, till only the most stubborn were left, who would then be crushed. This operation collapsed because its inventors had the mentality of rats themselves. In the Rebel Ball newspaper, next to the drawing of a woman showing a child a pair of handcuffs in a glass case, like the ones they kept your father in, appeared a cartoon of the last renegade, a black cat running through one of the holes in the wall. Cartoonists can always laugh, but the people in the camp had little to laugh about. The second, third, fourth, fifth week went by, something which, according to the laws of Gulag, could not last an hour, had lasted for an incredibly, indeed an agonizingly long time. Half of May and almost the whole of June. At first people were intoxicated with the joy of victory, with freedom, meetings and schemes. Then they believed that the rumors that Rudnik had risen, perhaps Cherbe, Nura, Spask, all Stepleg would follow. In no time at all, Karaganda would rise. The whole archipelago would erupt and fall in ash over the face of the land. But Rudnik put its hands behind its back, lowered its head, and reported, as before, for its 11th hour's shifts, contracting silicosis, and never a thought for Kengir or even for itself. No one supported the island of Kengir. It was impossible by now to take off into the wilderness. The garrison was being steadily reinforced. Troops were under canvas out on the steppe. The whole camp had been encircled with a double barbed wire fence outside the walls. There was only one rosy spot on the horizon. The Lord and Master they were expecting, Malenkov, was coming to dispense justice. He would come, kind man, and exclaim and throw up his hands. However could they live in such conditions, and why did you treat them like this? Put the murderers on trial, shoot Ch12 and Belyayev, sack the rest, but it was too tiny a spot and too rosy. They could not hope for pardon. All they could do was live out their last few days of freedom and submit to Stepleg's vengeance. There are always hearts which cannot stand the strain. Some were already morally crushed and were in agony of suspense for the crushing proper to begin. Some quietly calculated that they were not really involved and need not be if they went on being careful. Some were newly married, which is more, with a proper religious ceremony. A Western Ukrainian girl, for instance, will not marry without one, and thanks to Gulag thoughtfulness, there were priests of all religion there. For these newlyweds, the bitter and the sweet succeeded each other with a rapidity which ordinary people never experience in their slow lives. They observed each day as their last, and retribution delayed was a gift from heaven each morning. The believers prayed, and leaving the outcome to the Kengir revolt in God's hands, were, as always, the calmest people. Services for all religions were held in the mess hall according to a fixed timetable. The Jehovah's Witnesses felt free to observe their rules strictly and refused to build fortifications or stand guard. They sat for hours on end with their heads together, saying nothing. They were made to wash the dishes. A prophet, genuine or sham, went around the camp putting crosses on bunks and foretelling the end of the world. Conveniently for him, a severe cold spell set in, of the sort that a shift in the wind might bring. to Kazakhstan even in the summer. The old women he had gathered together sat, not very warmly dressed, on the cold ground, shivering and stretching out their hands to heaven. Where else could they turn? Some knew that they were fatally compromised, and that the few days before the troops arrived were all that was left of life. The theme of all their thoughts and actions must be how to hold out longer. These people were not the unhappiest. The unhappiest were those who were not involved and who prayed for the end. But when all these people gathered at meetings to decide whether to surrender or to hold on, they found themselves again in that heated climate where their personal opinions dissolved and ceased to exist even for themselves, or else they feared ridicule even more than the death that awaited them. Comrades, the majestic Kuznetsov said confidently, as though he knew many secrets, and all to the advantage of the prisoners, we have defensive firepower, and the enemy will suffer 50% of our own losses. He also said, even our destruction will not be in vain. In this he was absolutely right. The social temperature had its effect on him too. Even when they voted for or against holding out, the majority were for. Then Slushenkov gave an ominous warning. Just remember, if anyone remains in our ranks now and wants to surrender later, we shall settle accounts with him 5 minutes before he gets there. One day, the outside radio broadcast an order of the day to Gulag. For refusal to work, for sabotage, for this, that, and the other, the Kengir camp division of Steplag was to be disbanded and all prisoners sent to Magadan. Clearly, the planet was getting too small for Gulag, and those who had been sent to Magadan previously, what were they there for? One last chance to go back to work. Once more their last chance ran out, and things were as before. All was as it had been, and the dreamlike existence of these 8,000 men, suspended in mid-air, was rendered all the more startlingly improbable and strange by the regularity of camp routine. Fresh linen from the laundry, haircuts, clothes, and shoes repaired. There were even conciliation courts for disputes, even a release procedure. Yes, the outside radio sometimes summoned prisoners due for release. These were either foreigners from some country which had earned the right to gather in its citizens, or else people whose sentence was, or was said to be, nearing its end. Perhaps this was the administration's way of picking up tongues without the use of warders, ropes, and hooks. The commission sat on in, but had no means of verification and let them all go. Why did it drag on so long? What can the bosses have been waiting for? For the food to run out? They knew it would last a long time. Were they considering opinion in the settlement? They had no need to. Were they carefully working out their plan of repression? They could have been quicker about it. True, it was learned later that they had sent for a special purposes, meaning punitive regimen, from somewhere around Karaganda. It's a job not everyone can do. Were they having to seek approval from the operation up top? And how? How high up? There is no knowing on what date and at what level the decision was taken. On several occasions, the main gate of the service yard suddenly opened, perhaps to test the readiness of the defenders. The duty picket sounded the alarm, and the platoons poured out to meet the enemy, but no one entered the campgrounds. The only field intelligence service the defenders had were the observers on the hut roofs. Their anticipations were based entirely on what the fence permitted them to see from the rooftops. In the middle of June, several tractors appeared in the settlement. They were working, shifting something perhaps around the boundary fence. They began working even at night. These nocturnal tractor operations were baffling. Just in case, the prisoners started digging ditches opposite the gaps as an additional defense. They were all photographed or sketched from an observation plane. The unfriendly roar made the night seem blacker. Then suddenly the skeptics were put to shame, and the defeatists, and all who had said that there would be no mercy, and that there was no point in begging. The Orthodox alone could feel triumphant. On June 22nd, the outside radio announced that the prisoners' demands had been accepted. A member of the Presidium of the Central Committee was on his way. The rosy spot turned into a rosy sun, a rosy sky. It is, then, possible to get through to them. There is, then, justice in our country. They will give a little, and we will give a little. If it comes to it, we can walk about with number patches, and the bars on the windows needn't bother us. We aren't thinking of climbing out. You say they're tricking us again? Well, they aren't asking us to report for work beforehand. Just as the touch of a stick will draw off the charge from an electroscope, so that the agitated gold leaf sinks gratefully to rest, so did the radio announcement reduce the brooding tension of that last week. Even the loathsome tractors, after working for a while, on the evening of June 24th, stopped their noise. Prisoners could sleep peacefully on the 40th night of the revolt. He would probably arrive tomorrow. Perhaps he had come already. Thus, the short June nights are too short to have your sleep out, and you are fast asleep at dawn. It was like that summer 13 years before. In the early dawn of Friday, June 25th, parachutes carrying flares opened out in the sky. More flares soared from the watchtowers, and the observers on the rooftops were picked off by snipers' bullets before they could let out a squeak. The cannon fire was heard. Airplanes skimmed the camp, spreading panic. Tanks, the famous T-34s, had taken up position under cover of the tractor noise and now moved on the gaps from all sides. One of them, however, fell into a ditch. Some of the tanks dragged concatenations of barbed wire on trestles so that they could divide up the campgrounds immediately. Behind others ran helmeted assault troops with Tommy guns. Both Tommy gunners and tank crews had to be given vodka first. However special the troops may be, it is easier to destroy unarmed and sleeping people with drink inside you. Operators with walkie-talkies came in with the advancing troops. The generals went up to the towers with snipers, and from there, in the broad daylight, shed by the flares, and the light from the tower set on fire by the Zeks with their incendiary bombs, gave their orders. Take hut number so-and-so. That's where Kuznetsov is. They did not hide in observation posts, as they usually do, because no bullets threatened them. From a distance, from their burning sites, free workers watched the operation. The camp woke up, frightened out of its wits. Some stayed where they were in their huts, laying on the floor as their one chance of survival, and because resistance seemed useless, senseless. Others tried to make them get up and join the resistance, yet others ran right into the line of fire, either to fight or to seek a quicker death. The 3rd Camp Division fought. The division which had started it all. It consisted mainly of 58s, with a large majority of Banderists. They hurled stones at the Tommy gunners and warders, and probably sulfur bombs at the tanks. Nobody thought of the powdered glass. One had counterattacked twice, with shouts of hurrah. The tanks crushed everyone in their way. Alla Presman from Kiev was run over. The tracks passed over her abdomen. Tanks rode up on the porches of huts and crushed people there, including 2 Estonian women, Ingrid Kivi and Makalpa. The tanks grazed the sides of huts and crushed those who were clinging to them. to escape the caterpillar track. Semyon Rak and his girl ended that way. Semyon Rak and his girl threw themselves under a tank, collapsed in each other's arms, and ended it that way. Tanks nosed into the thin board walls of the huts and even fired blank shells into them. Fina Epstein remembers the corner of a hut collapsing as if in a nightmare, and a tank passing obliquely over the wreckage and over living bodies. Women tried to jump and fling themselves out of the way. Behind the tank came a lorry, and a half-naked women were tossed onto it. The cannon shots were blank, but the Tommy guns were shooting live rounds, and the bayonets were cold steel. Women tried to shield men with their own bodies, and they too were bayoneted. Security officer Belyayev shot 24 people with his own hand that morning. When the battle was over, he was seen putting knives into the hands of corpses for the photographer to take pictures of dead gangsters. Supran, a member of the commission and a grandmother, died from a wound in her lung. Some prisoners hid in the latrines and were riddled with bullets there. Kuznetsov was arrested in the bathhouse, his command post, and made to kneel. Slushenkov was lifted high in the air with his hands tied behind his back and dashed to the ground, a favorite trick with the thieves. Then the sound of shooting died away. There were shouts of, "Come on, come out of your huts, we won't shoot." Nor did they. They merely beat prisoners with their gun butts. As groups of prisoners were taken, they marched through the gaps onto the steppe, and between files of Kengir convoy troops outside, they were searched and made to lie flat on their faces, with their arms outstretched straight out. As they lay there, thus crucified, MVD flyers and warders walked among them to identify and pull out those whom they had spotted earlier from the air or from the watchtowers. So busy were they with all this that no one had leisure to open Pravda that day. It had a special theme, a day in the life of our motherland, the successes of steel workers, more and more crops harvested by machine, the historian surveying our country as it was that day will have an easy task. Curious officers could now inspect the secrets of the service yard, see where the electric power had come from and what secret weapons were there. The victorious generals descended from the watchtowers and went off to breakfast. Without knowing any of them, I feel confident that their appetite that June morning left nothing to be desired, and they drank deeply. An alcoholic hum would not in the least disturb the ideological harmony in their heads, and what they had for hearts was something installed with a screwdriver. The number of those killed or wounded was about 600, according to the stories, but according to figures given by Kengir Division's production planning section, which became known some months later, it was more than 700. When they had crammed the camp hospital with wounded, they began taking them into town. The free workers were informed that the troops had fired only blanks, and the prisoners had been killing each other. It was tempting to make the survivors dig the graves, but to prevent the story from spreading too far, this was done by troops. They buried 300 in a corner of the camp, and the rest somewhere out on the steppe. All day, on June 25th, the prisoners lay face down on the steppe in the sun. For days on end, the heat had been unmerciful. While in camp, there was an endless searching and breaking open and shaking out. Later, bread and water was brought out onto the steppe. The officers had lists ready. They called the roll, put a tick by those who were still alive. Gave their bread ration, and consulting their lists, at once divided the prisoners into groups. The members of the commission and other suspects were locked up in the camp jail, which was no longer needed for sightseers. More than 1,000 people were selected for dispatch, either to closed prisons or Kolyma. As always, these lists were drawn up partly by guesswork, so that many who had not been involved at all found their way into them. May this picture of the pacification bring peace to the souls of those of whom the last chapters have graded. Hands off, keep away. No one will have to take refuge in this safe deposit, and the punitive squads will never face retribution. On June 26th, the prisoners were made to spend the whole day taking down the barricades and bricking in the gaps. On June 27th, they were marched out to work. Those trains in the siding could wait no longer for working hands. The tanks which had crushed Kengir traveled under their own power to Rudnik and crawled around for the Zeks to see and draw their conclusions. The trial of the rebel leaders took place in autumn 1955, in camera, of course, and indeed we know nothing about it. Kuznetsov, they say, was very sure of himself and tried to prove that he had behaved impeccably and could have done so no better. We do not know what sentences were passed. Sushenkov, Mikhail Keller, and Nopkets were probably shot. I say probably because they certainly would have been shot earlier, but perhaps 1955 softened their fate. Back in Kengir, all was made ready for a life of honest toil. The bosses did not fail to create teams of shock workers from among yesterday's rebels. The self-financing system flourished. Food stalls were busy. Rubbishy films were shown. Warders and officers again sneaked into the service yard to have things made privately, a fishing reel, a money box, or to get the clasp mended on a lady's handbag. The rebel shoemakers and tailors, Lithuanians and Western Ukrainians, made light, elegant boots for the bosses and dresses for their wives. As of old, the Zeks at the separating plant were ordered to strip lead from the cables and bring back to the camp to be melted down for shot, so that the comrade officers could go hunting antelopes. By now, disarray had spread through the archipelago and reached Kengir. Bars were not put back on the windows. Huts were no longer locked. The two-thirds parole system was introduced, and there was even a quite unprecedented re-registration of 58. The half-dead were released. The grass on graves is usually very thick and green. In 1956, the camp area itself was liquidated. Local resident exiles who had stayed in Kengir discovered that they were buried and brought steppe tulips to put on their graves. Whenever you pass the Dolgurki monument, remember that it was unveiled during the Kengir revolt, and so has come to be, in some sense, a memorial to Kengir. End of part 5. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.